each party claims that they have a huge following, but the fact is, when they ask, is that more than half, or at least it had gotten to this not long ago, more than half of voters really don't associate themselves with the party. So when one party wins, they claim they have the following, but it's really they just happen to have won the bigger chunk of that 60% over to them. And I think that that will convince you that you must have been right. Depending on which 20% you are. So I think that is definitely part of the world, and we can see it in politics, and it does transcend into our sports.
Indeed, and maybe there was also an interesting aspects at play in that context as well as is the case in sport. I often look at trust surveys, and frankly, it's a bit of a depressing read, regardless of which region or country you look at, or if you look at it at an international level, because the conclusions are quite aligned and quite thought-provoking. So basically, these days, apparently, we trust nobody. We don't trust our political leaders. We don't trust our business leaders, and we don't even trust civil society leaders any longer. The ones we really trust are the ones who are like ourselves. But if we look at this from a sport perspective, I think what's really interesting is that whenever our favorite athletes speak up, regardless of what it is that they're speaking about, we as fans listen. And we listen across traditional societal dividing lines. And for me, that is very unique, and that is something to be fully utilized, something to yet be fully utilized. Among the things I do, I lead a project that links sports and the fight against climate change. And in that project, we look a lot at how we can engage athletes as the messengers, but also how we can create a credible messaging vis-a-vis fans. And at the end of the day, what's really interesting is that even for societal issues like climate change, but frankly it could be any societal issue, fans listen and are open to change their behavior or their mindsets based on what their favorite athletes tell them. And for societal issues, I therefore think that sport really has a unique positive potential in helping us address various societal issues that goes far beyond what we see in business, government, and civil society these days.
I would completely agree, and the most common message that athletes are asked to deliver is, what should we buy? It's the endorsements. So we know there's that power right there. But I agree with you that they're the idolizing of them, not to the point of what shoes should I buy, what sport drink should I be drinking, but what is the right behavior? That is what's, I think, terribly underutilized. We'll find them speaking here and there. We'll see interviews. But if we could get them to a more consistent platform on social issues, and some of them do, there are definitely plenty, but not nearly as much as I'm being told what to wear or drink, or how to make my aches and pains go away. Things like that. I think the power is definitely there. Let me ask you, you talked about distrust and things like that. What about when our sporting idols are found to be imperfect? And we can definitely talk about performance-enhancing drugs. That's the one for the last 20 years. That shattered my world in college, when it was, look at these gods of, in particular, baseball. When it was found that all the records really weren't being broken, it was huge that, this utopian area where it was baseball, it was pure to me. That's what I grew up believing. Just like around the world, it'll be soccer, football. What happens when we lose trust in the sporting figures? Is it worse than losing trust in politicians?
Well, I think there are different levels of trust. On one hand, there's the challenge around trust in individual athletes, and on the other hand, there is the challenge around trust in institutions, like, for instance, anti-doping agencies and eventually the World Anti-Doping Agency. But regardless of those two related but also different challenges, I would say that, of course, we always have high ideals when it comes to sport and athletes in particular. And, of course, we always get disappointed if anyone is not living up to our high expectations. But that is maybe my opportunity to go back to the point I was making before about sport being a reflection of society. Although we don't like it, I think we need to wake up and realize that sport is a reflection of society with all its beauty and all its flaws. So appreciating that, we should expect that occasionally there will be a case of wrongdoing in sport. And that is completely normal, and that is completely to be expected. And as far as I'm concerned, I would actually even turn things a bit the other way around and say, if there is a sport organization, if there is a sport that apparently never has an issue of doping, we should be really concerned about that. Because for me, that shows that the systems they have in place are not effective in reflecting reality on the ground. So basically not effective in picking up the cases of doping that we should expect to have. And therefore that in reality there is not a leveled playing field for athletes. So there is a lot of opportunity for the unprincipled, and because of that, there will be a big temptation for the 60% followers to also start taking doping. So for me, it's not helpful to basically close the eyes from reality and say we take a zero tolerance on an issue like doping. It could be any other issue. But excuse me, just 1 second. Now the thing happened that I was not expecting to happen.
Well, that's what I was telling you. It's no worries here. Mistakes are, like you say, this is why this is an authentic conversation.
Indeed. But basically my point about doping was to say that we need to make sure that our systems are effective. And that includes making sure that we also take a pragmatic approach around how we as human beings and athletes behave and are motivated. So obviously we should expect to occasionally have cases of wrongdoing, and I think that's an important message that sport leaders and sport organizations have to share with fans and others. So if you take a zero tolerance approach, you basically discourage anyone from having effective systems. So you often hear these days government officials or sponsors and others take very strong stance whenever there is a case of wrongdoing in sport. And I don't think it's helpful. I think what's much more helpful is saying we actually support the organizations that have effective systems in place. So it's not an issue that there is an occasional case of wrongdoing. It's an issue if there are systemic cases of wrongdoing, but it's also an issue if there is never a case of wrongdoing.
Oh, Michael, I think we've lost you for a little bit there.
No, I'm still here. I was just pausing for a second to see if that resonated with you, and then maybe
absolutely, yes,
if you had an additional question related to that. No?
Actually, I do, because I was doing a bit of daydreaming in my head about a previous employer where large company worked for a lot of large organizations that quality control was huge. And it was sadistic, to be honest, that I didn't have that client line. I had much smaller ones, yet we were subject to that system. And they did it two ways. One, they would say, well, hey, we got to find something wrong with your project, because it shows our clients that we're actually looking, that, you know, they expect imperfection. And to your, just like you said, because it's not credible. If you can't find something wrong with the project, you haven't looked close enough. So they had that part right. But then they decided that for all these mistakes you would find, even though their open statement was, you know, we're looking really hard. Don't be bothered when we find something. They actually created a culture that suggested it was zero tolerance. And therefore, people were trying to hide mistakes. And so, you know, they could find things, and they might have not been the ones that were critical, because people were so worried about the big mistakes that they were in fact hiding it. So that's when you mentioned the zero tolerance, I go back to that company culture, and it was one of those. I've seen the sign that makes me laugh at some offices. It says, the beatings will continue until morale improves, and then right next to it will be a sign that says people are our best, resource. So I agree. It's in sports we think it's utopian, that it shouldn't be a reflection of society, but it is in both that dual-edged sword that you have there, which is nobody believes somebody that's completely innocent, yet none of us, yet there's a penalty for being human.
Indeed, and I'm reminded of a recent experience around looking at one of the reports that is frequently published by the World Anti-Doping Agency. Basically, the report indicating how many positive tests have they had in different sports in different countries over the course of the last year. And it's an interesting read, and it's also interesting to look at how people then start making conclusions and potentially wrong conclusions on the basis of such a report. So basically, if you look at the report, which is comprised of actual figures, you'll see that sports like weightlifting, like cycling, like athletics have very high numbers of positive doping tests. And from a country perspective, you would see that the countries such as Italy and France also have quite high numbers. So one temptation is obviously when you read something like that is to say, well, it seems like doping is a big issue in those kind of sports and in those kind of countries. And then the ones creating the incentive structures would then say, well, we need to do some work in those sports and in those countries, and eventually we're going to sanction them if they don't end up with better numbers next year. No, for me there is a big risk at play there, because the numbers could actually indicate something very different. They could actually indicate that weightlifting, cycling, and athletics have become the most effective ones in actually catching the doping cheaters. And the same for countries as France and Italy. So they should actually potentially not be sanctioned. They should actually be recognized for all the great efforts. I mean, that's another potential conclusion. And a bit along the same lines, I would actually say maybe we need to be concerned about the sports and the countries that have zero positive cases, because that just cannot reflect reality. So why should they not be sanctioned? Why should the ones that are potentially the most effective ones be sanctioned? Or even to take a bit more sophisticated an approach, where you could basically say maybe the red flag is both where you have the high number of cases, but also where you have 0 cases, so that actually we work at both